Utah is recognized.
Mr. President, as we've undertaken this conversation, I can't help but reflect on the fact that we're here in a representative body. We're here in order to have an exchange of ideas. We're here to engage in political speech, not the kind of political speech that people think of when they think of the word politics, where they think of something necessarily unpleasant. You know, when people hear the word political or politics, they think of the two Greek roots of the word politics. You've got poly, which means many, and ticks, which are blood-sucking parasites, and they assume that if it's political, it's unpleasant. But I'm using the word political here in a different sense, in a sense that refers to the body politic, refers to the fact that we're here doing the people's business. The exchange of information, of ideas, is essential to everything we do. And it occurs to me that the mask discussion does carry a deeper meaning here, a deeper meaning that takes into account the fact that when we communicate, sometimes with words, sometimes without words, sometimes in print, sometimes with the spoken word, sometimes without any words at all, we're engaging in activity that is protected by the First Amendment. Now, this is important in a wide swath of areas. It's important for how we worship or decline to do the same. It's important in how we express our viewpoints in our news and our entertainment, media, every aspect of our lives. It's important. It's regarded as especially important in a body politic that people be able to express their feelings about government and about the role of government. It's also especially important here that people be able to speak and otherwise communicate in a way that's clear and unvarnished, unfiltered. In fact, we go so far even as to protect members of Congress from liability in what they would say on the floor of the Senate or the House of Representatives. We do that because we feel that a full, frank, informed discussion is important. We don't want members being threatened with some sort of action, civil or criminal, based on things that they would utter here. So freedom of speech is important for all citizens. It's also important to make sure that that freedom of speech is protected here. And it occurs to me that with the question of masks, the decision of whether to wear a mask is not only deeply personal, but it's also, in this context, quite arguably expressive. Even before you utter a single word, and regardless of whether you utter a single word. In many respects, your decision to wear a mask or not wear a mask is itself a form of expression. And as a form of expression, it's protected. In a long line of cases, the Supreme Court of the United States has identified conduct that is expressive and therefore protected by the First Amendment, notwithstanding the fact that it doesn't necessarily involve words. When you merge that with another line of analysis under First Amendment jurisprudence, we remember the fact that it's a problem whenever government suppresses speech in one way or another. It is especially problematic when the government tries to compel speech. When the government tries to direct an individual that he or she must utter certain words in order to be compliant with the dictates of the government. That implicates the compelled speech doctrine, and the compelled speech doctrine is an especially rigid one. It's an especially rigid one with very good reason. You don't want to force people to say stuff. It's not the government's role. That's the whole idea behind the First Amendment, is that the government needs to stay out of our headspace. It needs to stay out of where we worship. It needs to stay out of our relationship with God. It needs to stay out of printing presses, and it needs to stay out of what we say. Sometimes what we say can consist of things that don't even involve words, something as simple as whether or not to wear a mask. So in addition to all the other public policy reasons, in addition to all the problems with having a CDC issuing these sweeping mandates and edicts without bothering to back up those edicts with scientific justification, even after months and months of receiving inquiries from members of the United States Senate that they do so. Separate and apart from all of those issues, I think it's important for us to look at the speech element, the expressive conduct that's inherent in whether or not you wear a mask, and whether or not by compelling people to wear a mask, you're compelling people to engage in state-sponsored speech. You're telling them that they must send a message with which they may well disagree. Now, if I'm wrong on this, if this is strictly a medical issue, then it will be backed up by scientific medical evidence. That is the nature of the problem that I have with the CDC's mandate. It's ever-fluctuating mandate. It's mandate that as recently as a few days ago flip-flopped yet again. If, in fact, it were medical and scientific, it would be backed up as such, but it's not. This is a form of compelled speech. Not as we traditionally understand it, because compelled speech usually involves the utterance of specific words. But we know that speech can be protected even if it doesn't involve words, if it's a type of expressive conduct which wearing a mask is, especially if, as here, we don't have scientific evidence making it a medical issue. So I would ask the Speaker of the House, are you really going to arrest people for not saying what you want them to say? That's not okay. If it would never be okay for you to arrest people for not saying words that you have prescribed for them, why is it okay for you to compel them to engage in expressive conduct not amounting to speech? It's not. Make no mistake, Mr. President. This isn't medical. This isn't scientific. If it were, we would have evidence of such. We don't. In light of that, separate and apart from all the other problems, problems that inhere in our form of government, problems that inhere in the fact that we do, in fact, have three distinct branches of our federal government, that most laws are not federal laws to begin with. Most laws originate in the states and in the localities. Most laws are not federal, and they should never be. But for those things that should be federal laws, we've got one and only one branch of government that makes laws. It is no coincidence, Mr. President, that the very first clause of the very first section of the very first article of the Constitution provides, and I quote, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives." Article 1, Section 7 then goes on to outline the formula contemplated in Article 1, Section 1. In Article 1, Section 7, it says that you can't make a law under our form of government, at least not a federal law, without passage in the House of Representatives and passage in the Senate and presentment to the President of the United States. In many respects, these recommendations issued by the CDC end up carrying the force of generally applicable federal law. That's wrong, and in many, many respects, that's on us. Look, we've done a horrible job over the last few years. I'd say over the last few decades. I'd say over the last 80, 85 years, really. And I won't lay the blame entirely at the feet of either party. In fact, this has happened under the control of different parties. It's happened with Senates and Houses of Representatives and White Houses of every conceivable partisan combination. We've seen the de facto outsourcing of our lawmaking authority to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. Men and women who, while well-educated, well-intentioned, hard-working, and highly specialized, don't work for the people. They don't work for you. You do not have the ability to elect them or unelect them. You don't have the authority to replace them. That's why it's so dangerous for us to give them this sweeping authority. And even where they don't technically have authority that extends very far, and in this case, it's far too far, as evidenced by the fact that any time you get on an airplane or other mode of public transportation, you're told that under penalty of federal law, you must wear a mask. But I would ask, where's the act of Congress providing that? In what year did the Congress of the United States pass through the House and through the Senate and submit to the President of the United States for signature or veto a law stating that you must wear a mask on a plane or a train or a bus or in a bus depot or a train station or at an airport under penalty of federal law? There is no such law. You will not find it. Now, you'll find some other stuff in which we've delegated far too much authority, in which we've given broad authority to the executive branch, to people like the CDC, to issue regulations. But as a matter of proper form, whenever they exercise that power, it's not appropriate for that to take effect by itself. It's not really a law in the constitutional sense of the word, unless Congress has enacted it. So we've given them far too much power anyway, and that is on us. We shouldn't do that. That's why I've been calling for years for reforms to this. Why I've been calling for years for reforms, including but not limited to the REINS Act, which would require for any economically significant federal regulation, before it takes effect, must be passed by both houses of Congress and presented to the President for signature or veto. Why I've introduced the Global Trade Accountability Act, which would do for trade policy what the REINS Act does for regulatory policy. Why we need to reform so many aspects of our laws, where we've, as a practical matter, made the unelected and the unaccountable the supreme lawgivers, the lawmakers, law interpreters, and law enforcers. This is not just something that can lead to tyranny, it is the very definition of tyranny, as every signer of the United States Constitution understood well. It's why they went to great lengths to separate out these three branches of government. But in addition to those problems with these edicts, not based on science or medicine, based on political considerations that are ever-changing, it's why they're so sweeping, it's why they're so troubling. But they're made even more troubling still for the additional constitutional reason that at the end of the day, to whatever degree these are not rooted in medical science and fact, which I believe they're not, or at least the CDC hasn't established as much, then they really do amount to something compelling expressive conduct. The expression of an official orthodoxy mandated by the government. We shouldn't accept this. We shouldn't accept any affirmative legal obligation placed on those we represent, to whom and for whose benefit we've sworn an oath to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, which requires us to make any law we force on the American people. We have an obligation to them, a solemn obligation, to make sure they're not subject to laws made by those not of their own choosing. It's these very features that James Madison had in mind when he authored Federalist number 62. When he wrote, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, it'll be of little benefit to the American people that their laws may be written by men of their own choosing, if those laws be so voluminous, complex, and ever-changing that they can't reasonably understand what the law means and predict what it will say from one day to the next. Today, this week even, we've seen that the law be so unpredictable and ever-changing. We can't expect what the law says from one day to another. But even worse, contrary to what Madison assumed would always be the case because the Constitution required it, the laws aren't even being written by men and women of our own choosing, but instead by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats who, despite how well-educated, well-intentioned, hardworking, and highly specialized they may be, don't work for you. Nor do they have authority under this document, to which we've all sworn an oath, to make laws. That's our power, and shame on us if we relinquish to them the power that only we can exercise, that is itself non-delegable. Shame on us further if we allow those same people who, lacking the authority to legislate in the first instance, then transgress another affirmative constitutional command by compelling compliance with official government-mandated orthodoxy. This cannot be, this cannot stand. I will not stand for it, and I'll continue to draw attention to this issue until we've resolved it properly. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.